History of the Death Penalty, A Balanced Perspective by Professor Dave Heffernan of Valencia College. This is Part 5 of 5. Review of Part 4. 1935 was the peak year for executions in America at 199 executions. Between 1847 and 1853, 3 states abolished the death penalty. Between 1907 and 1917, 9 states abolished the death penalty. Legislative reform came to a stop between 1917 and 1919. Of the 15 states that had done away with capital punishment by 1917, by 1920 only 8 were left. The northern states were debating about abolishing capital punishment for murder. In the South, the death penalty was still seen as a means of racial control. Lynchings were a form of unofficial capital punishment. Lethal injection became the #1 method of execution after its 1997 approval. For the first half of today's presentation, we're going to look at Florida's execution history. Prior to 1923, executions in Florida were handled by the counties. When the state took control, they switched the method from hanging to electrocution. 1827 was the first known execution in Florida of Benjamin Donica, hung for murder. Florida has had 30 exonerations from death row, more than any other state. 1976. The Supreme Court restates the death penalty when it upholds Georgia's statute in Gregg versus Georgia. In Profit v. Florida, the court upholds the Florida statute. Florida was the first state to reintroduce the death penalty after Furman v. Georgia struck down all existing death penalty laws. In 2016, Florida statutorily abolished the judicial override, which is the process by which a trial judge was permitted to impose death sentences despite an advisory jury recommendation for life. In Hurst v. Florida in 2016, the court ruled that Florida's sentencing statute violated the Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial because it required the judge, rather than the jury, to make findings of fact as to whether the prosecution had proven that the defendant is eligible to face the death penalty. In 2017, Florida statutorily abolished the non-unanimous jury recommendation for death and requires that sentencing jury unanimously recommend a death sentence before a trial judge may impose a death sentence. Florida's reversal. The court's January 23, 2020 decision in State v. Poole reinstated a death sentence imposed on Mark Anthony Poole in 2011 after a non-unanimous jury voted 11-1 to recommend the death penalty. The court majority said that the Hurst decision, had misunderstood the U.S. Supreme Court case decisions that had granted capital defendants the right to have a jury decide all facts necessary to impose the death sentence. Justice George Laborga issued a strong dissent, writing that the court has taken a giant step backwards and removed a significant safeguard for the just application of the death penalty in Florida. In recent Florida legislation, in the 2020 legislative session, House Bill 645 and Senate Bill 938 would repeal the death penalty. Both died in subcommittee. In the current session, 2021, House Bill 619 and Senate Bill 568 would repeal the death penalty, and they were both filed on January 11, 2021. Florida, an example in desperate sentencing. In America today, the strongest indicator of whether you will receive a death sentence is what state and county you commit the crime in and who's the district attorney. If the county has recent history in sentencing someone to death, your chances are increased. Florida has led the country in the number of death sentences in the past 2 years and has the second largest death row in the country. It also has more people exonerated and freed from death row than any other state in the country. Within the state, over 28% of the most recent 60 death sentences came from just one of the state's 20 judicial circuits, the 4th Judicial District including Duval, Clay, and Nassau counties. Duval County in northeastern Florida, where Jacksonville is, has the highest per capita rate of inmates on death row of any U.S. county. Duval has sentenced one person to death for every 14,000 residents. It's among the 2% of counties in the U.S. responsible for the majority of all inmates on death row as of 2013. Duval County is ranked 8th in the nation with 60 inmates on death row. Duval has handed down 14 death sentences in the last 5 years. According to Harvard's Law Report, there's a history of overzealous prosecutions, inadequate defense lawyering, and a pattern of racial bias and exclusion. In the remaining slides, we're going to examine the decline of the death penalty. New death sentences have fallen more than 85% since peaking at more than 300 death sentences per year in the mid-1990s. Executions have declined by 75% since peaking at 98 in 1999. Public support for the death penalty has been declining in recent years. So who supports death penalty the most? Republicans more than Democrats, men more than women, whites more than blacks, Protestants more than Catholics, and the middle age more than young or old. A recent Gallup poll shows that life imprisonment is now favored by the majority of Americans. For the first time, the majority of Americans say that life imprisonment without the possibility of parole is better punishment for murder than the death penalty. There are a number of possible factors that may be influencing the decline in the death penalty. One is declining world favor. Another, the cost of the death penalty. The efficacy of the death penalty. Disparate sentencing, which we've already seen. And shortly I'll discuss the juvenile decision and the fact that science has diffused the deterrence theories. Declining world favor. Over 70% of the countries in the world have abolished the death penalty. The trend is that the number of countries allowing the death penalty is decreasing, as are death sentences and executions. Just over 50 countries still practice the death penalty. This includes the world leader, China, and Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and, of course, America. Cost of death penalty cases. It's become clear in the last few years that the cost of death penalty cases are 2 to 3 times the cost of life in prison cases. Much of it has to do with the court processes that are required to ensure due process rights are administered here in this country. Even with reforms, the costs are still substantial. Efficacy of the death penalty. This data set is the average annual estimate for the decade of the 90s. So in an average year, 22,000 criminal homicides were reported. Of that, there were 15,000 arrests for homicide. 13,500 homicide cases were actually prosecuted. 10,000 was the number of homicide convictions. Of those, 2,000 to 4,000 would be death-eligible defendants, depending on the state they lived in. 300 would be the number sentenced to death. 55 would be the actual number executed. This equates to 0.25% of reported homicides result in an execution. Contrary to the perception that the death penalty is widely used in the United States, it's actually a product of a distinct minority of counties. Only 2% of the counties account for the majority of today's death row population. These are the top 10 counties that account for over 27% of all death row inmates as of January 1st, 2013. But these are fewer than 1% of the counties in the U.S. And as you can see, while Duval is number 1 in the country per capita, it's number 8 in total death row inmates serving time. Juvenile decision. In 2005, in the case Roper v. Simmons, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty imposed on those who had committed their crimes under 18 years of age was considered cruel and unusual punishment. One of the justifications for this ruling was that we were the only country in the world that still officially sanctioned executing juveniles. Deterrence diffused. Scientific studies have generally found that the practice of capital punishment does not deter capital crime. Some studies actually find the opposite, that the practice of capital punishment may increase capital crimes like murder. Studies like these have given rise to what is known as the brutalization hypothesis, which suggests that there is a cause and effect relationship between executions and the increase in the homicide rate. The idea is that executions are not a deterrent, they actually diminish society's respect for life. Historical irony. Because of the way the government and laws are structured in England, the British Parliament abolished capital punishment through law, even though the majority of the population approved of it. In the U.S., historically more than half of Americans approve of the death penalty. Every time someone would attempt to abolish it, one of the legal avenues available in our legal system was utilized to reverse the decision. Legislators were overruled by ballot measures, attorneys would use the courts to override decisions made by governors, etc. Approximately 1/2 of U.S. states currently allow the use of the death penalty. Review of Part 5. Florida has had 30 exonerations from death row, more than any other state. Florida was the first state to reintroduce the death penalty after Gregg v. Georgia. In the past 5 years, Florida has had a series of significant court cases to keep its death penalty laws viable. The strongest indicator of a death sentence conviction is what state and county you commit the crime in and who's the district attorney. The practice of the death penalty is declining both nationally and internationally. Thank you. This concludes a 5-part series on the history of the death penalty, a balanced perspective. I'm Professor Dave Heffernan, and if you'd like to send me comments or corrections, please email me at dheffernan@valenciacollege.edu. I spent over a year researching the death penalty. I read all of the relevant books, articles, and research papers on this topic, and I have to highly recommend Banner's The Death Penalty in American History. Out of all the books I read on this topic, this is the most comprehensive, detailed, and well-researched. Farewell.